Hi, I'm Sherlock. Welcome to my new mystery case.
The November fog of 1891 had settled upon London with a persistence that seemed almost malevolent, transforming the familiar streets into a maze of grey phantoms and muffled sounds. From our sitting room at 221B Baker Street, the world beyond our windows appeared as little more than suggestion and shadow, the gas lamps struggling to pierce the thick veil that had descended upon the city like a burial shroud. It was on such a morning that I found my friend Sherlock Holmes in one of his restless moods, pacing before the fireplace with the nervous energy of a caged predator, his sharp features illuminated intermittently by the dancing flames. "Watson," he declared without preamble as I entered the room, "observe how this infernal fog has reduced our great metropolis to a collection of disembodied voices and phantom footsteps. One might commit the perfect crime in such conditions, leaving no witness save the mist itself." His grey eyes held that peculiar gleam I had come to associate with the beginning of our most intriguing adventures, though as yet no case had presented itself to engage his remarkable faculties. As if summoned by his words, the sound of hurried footsteps echoed from the stairway, followed by Mrs. Hudson's familiar knock. "Mr. Holmes," came her voice through the door. "There's a gentleman from Scotland Yard, accompanied by a lady in considerable distress. They say the matter is most urgent." Holmes's demeanour transformed instantly, the restless energy focusing into sharp attention. "Send them up immediately, Mrs. Hudson." He turned to me with that thin smile that invariably preceded our most challenging cases. "It appears the fog has delivered us a mystery after all, Watson." Inspector Lestrade entered first, his weathered face bearing an expression of professional bewilderment that I had rarely seen upon his usually confident features. Behind him came a woman of perhaps 30 years, elegantly dressed despite the early hour, her dark eyes red-rimmed with recent tears, yet burning with a fierce determination that spoke of considerable strength of character. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson," Lestrade began, removing his hat with uncharacteristic hesitancy. "I find myself confronting a case that defies every principle of criminal investigation I have learned in 20 years with the Yard. May I present Miss Evangeline Ashford, whose uncle, Mr. Theodore Ashford, has vanished under circumstances that are, quite frankly, impossible." The lady stepped forward with admirable composure despite her evident distress. "Mr. Holmes, I have heard of your reputation for solving cases that baffle ordinary minds. I pray you can help us, for I fear my uncle is in mortal danger, if indeed he still lives." Holmes gestured toward the chairs by the fire, his manner immediately attentive and courteous. "Please, Miss Ashford, be seated. Inspector Lestrade, you as well. Now then, pray tell me the circumstances of your uncle's disappearance, omitting no detail, however trivial it may seem." Miss Ashford composed herself with visible effort before beginning her account. "My uncle is a man of precise habits, Mr. Holmes. He retired to his study at precisely 9 o'clock last evening, as is his custom, to attend to his correspondence. The study is on the second floor of our house in Belgravia, with windows that overlook the garden. I was reading in the drawing-room below when I heard him moving about overhead, the familiar sounds of his evening routine. At 10:30 I retired to my room, which is directly above his study. I could hear him still at work, the scratch of his pen upon paper. "And the household?" Holmes inquired, his fingers steepled beneath his chin. "My uncle maintains a small staff. Mrs. Hartwell, our housekeeper, retired to her quarters in the basement at 10 o'clock. James, our butler, secured the house at 10:30, checking every door and window, as he does each night without fail. He then retired to his room on the 3rd floor. I myself heard him moving about overhead as I prepared for bed." Lestrade shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Here's where it becomes impossible, Mr. Holmes. Miss Ashford was awakened at midnight by what she describes as a sound like breaking glass. She went immediately to her uncle's study and found the door locked from the inside. When she received no response to her knocking, she summoned James, who was forced to break down the door. "And what did you discover?" Holmes asked, though I could see from his expression that he had already begun to form theories. Miss Ashford's voice trembled slightly as she continued. "The study was empty, Mr. Holmes. My uncle had simply vanished. The windows were locked from the inside, the key still in place. There was no sign of struggle, no indication of how he might have left the room, but upon his desk lay a letter that chills my blood to recall." She reached into her reticule and withdrew a folded piece of paper, which she handed to Holmes with evident reluctance. "It is written in my uncle's own hand, yet the content is utterly bewildering." Holmes unfolded the letter with his characteristic delicacy, holding it near the lamp to examine both the paper and the handwriting. His eyes moved rapidly across the page, and I observed the slight tightening around his eyes that indicated his intense concentration. "Most singular," he murmured, then looked up at our visitors. "With your permission, Miss Ashford, I shall read this aloud for Dr. Watson's benefit." At her nod, he began. "My dear Evangeline, if you are reading this, then the fog has claimed me as I always knew it must. The sins of the past have found their way through the mist to collect their due. Do not mourn overmuch, for this ending was written long ago in the ledgers of justice. The key to understanding lies where the Thames meets the sky, and the truth sleeps beneath the stones of memory. Your devoted uncle, Theodore Ashford." The silence that followed was broken only by the crackling of the fire and the distant sounds of the fog-shrouded city beyond our windows. I found myself studying the letter with growing fascination, noting the quality of the paper and the steadiness of the handwriting, which showed no sign of distress or coercion. "Inspector," Holmes said finally, "I assume you have verified that this is indeed Mr. Ashford's handwriting." "We have, Mr. Holmes. I brought samples from his business correspondence, and there's no doubt the hand is his, and the paper comes from his own desk set." Lestrade leaned forward in his chair. "But here's what troubles me most. According to Miss Ashford, her uncle was in excellent health and spirits. He had no known enemies, no financial difficulties, no reason to harm himself or disappear voluntarily. Yet this letter suggests he expected his fate." Holmes rose and moved to the window, gazing out at the impenetrable fog that pressed against the glass like a living thing. "Tell me, Miss Ashford, what was your uncle's profession?" "He was a shipping agent, Mr. Holmes, specializing in cargo from the Far East. He had offices near the London docks and maintained extensive correspondence with merchants in India and China. He was quite successful and well regarded in his field." "And his past? Any military service, travel to exotic locations, involvement in matters that might have made him enemies?" Miss Ashford hesitated, a shadow crossing her features. "He served briefly in India as a young man, though he rarely spoke of those days. I know there was some unpleasantness that led to his early return to England, but he never discussed the details. He always said the past was best left buried." Holmes turned from the window, his eyes now bright with that familiar intensity that indicated the game was truly afoot. "Yet it appears, Miss Ashford, that the past has refused to remain buried. Inspector, I shall need to examine Mr. Ashford's study immediately. The fog may have delivered this mystery to us, but I suspect the solution lies not in supernatural intervention, but in very human motives and methods." As we prepared to venture into the grey maze of London's fog-shrouded streets, I could not shake the feeling that we stood at the threshold of one of our most challenging cases. The impossible disappearance, the prophetic letter, and the references to past sins all suggested a complexity that would test every faculty of my friend's remarkable mind. Yet I had seen Holmes triumph over seemingly insurmountable puzzles before, and I felt that familiar thrill of anticipation as we prepared to pit our wits against an adversary who had used the very fog itself as an accomplice in their mysterious design. The journey through London's fog-shrouded streets proved both treacherous and contemplative, our hansom cab moving at little more than walking pace as the driver navigated by memory and instinct through the grey void. Holmes sat in thoughtful silence beside me, occasionally withdrawing the mysterious letter from his coat to study it once more in the dim light filtering through the cab's windows. The clip-clop of the horses' hooves echoed strangely in the muffled atmosphere, creating an almost otherworldly sensation as we made our way toward Belgravia. "Watson," Holmes said suddenly, breaking the silence, "what strikes you most about the timing of Mr. Ashford's letter? He writes of fog claiming him, yet according to Miss Ashford, this particular fog descended only yesterday evening. Either remarkable prescience or careful planning." Before I could respond, our cab lurched to a halt, and the driver's voice called down through the murk. "Belgrave Square, gentlemen, though I confess I'm navigating more by providence than sight in this infernal weather." The Ashford residence proved to be an imposing Georgian townhouse, its elegant facade barely visible through the thick fog that seemed to cling to every surface. Miss Ashford met us at the door, having arrived ahead of us, her composure somewhat restored, though the strain remained evident in her bearing. A distinguished man of perhaps 50 years stood waiting in the entrance hall, his professional demeanour unable to entirely mask an underlying anxiety. "James will show you to my uncle's study," Miss Ashford said, gesturing toward the butler. "He has served our family for 30 years and knew my uncle's habits better than anyone." As we ascended the stairs, James spoke in measured tones that carried the weight of long service. "I must confess, Mr. Holmes, that yesterday evening brought an unusual occurrence. The master received a piece of foreign correspondence with the afternoon post, quite different from his usual business letters. The paper was of an exotic quality, with an unusual postmark that I could not readily identify. Mr. Ashford examined it with considerable interest before retiring to his study." Holmes paused on the landing, his attention immediately focused. "And this foreign letter was not among those found on his desk?" "No, sir. Only the letter he penned to Miss Evangeline remained. Whatever correspondence he received yesterday has vanished along with the master himself." We continued to the second floor, where James led us to a heavy oak door showing clear signs of having been forced. The splintered wood around the lock bore testimony to the violence necessary to gain entry, though the door had been carefully repaired. "I took the liberty of having it mended this morning," James explained. "Miss Evangeline felt it important to preserve the room exactly as we found it. The study itself was a perfect sanctuary of scholarly comfort, with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves and tall windows facing the garden." Holmes immediately moved to examine the windows, testing each lock methodically while running his fingers along the frames. His magnifying glass appeared as he studied the sills with particular attention. "James," Holmes said without looking up, "you mentioned hearing sounds from above as you secured the house. Can you be more specific?" The butler considered carefully. "The usual sounds at first, sir. Footsteps, the creak of his chair, drawers opening and closing. But just before midnight there was something different. Rather like a door closing, but muffled, not quite right." Holmes's examination grew more intense. At the window facing the garden he paused, his lens focusing on minute details invisible to my untrained eye. "Most illuminating," he murmured, carefully extracting something with his fingernail. "Hemp fibers, Watson, old, tarred, and recently disturbed." Moving to examine the doorframe, Holmes discovered a tiny smudge of green paint on the brass handle, fresh enough to transfer to his finger when touched. His investigation continued to the fireplace, where he knelt to study not the grate itself, but the hearthstones, one of which showed signs of recent disturbance. "The neighbouring property, James. Is there construction work in progress?" "Yes, sir. Scaffolding has been erected against the west wall these past 3 days. The workers have permission to access our garden for their ladder placement." Holmes nodded, a thin smile playing at his lips as he examined the carpet near the window. To my eyes it appeared undisturbed, but Holmes traced what seemed to be a faint path from window to desk with his finger. "Inspector," Holmes said finally, straightening from his examination, "I shall require discreet inquiries made of these scaffold workers. Also, the address of Mr. Percival Dunn, the business partner who visited yesterday evening." As we prepared to leave the study, Holmes paused at the desk, his eyes resting on the crystal paperweight that held down various business correspondence. He lifted it slightly as if testing its weight, then replaced it with mathematical precision. "The fog may have provided cover," he said quietly, "but it could not erase all traces of human passage. Your uncle, Miss Ashford, has left us a trail, though not the one he intended. Our departure from the Ashford residence led us first to the rear garden, where Holmes insisted upon examining the area beneath the study windows, despite the increasingly oppressive fog. The scaffolding James had mentioned loomed like a skeletal spectre against the neighbouring building, its wooden framework barely visible through the grey veil that seemed to thicken with each passing moment. Holmes dropped to one knee beneath the study window, his magnifying glass appearing as if by magic as he scrutinized the stone sill with methodical precision. "Watson, observe these fresh abrasions along the edge of the sill," he said, his voice carrying that particular tone of satisfaction that indicated a significant discovery. "The stone has been recently scored by rope under considerable tension, and here," he indicated a dark smear barely visible to my untrained eye, "traces of tar that have not yet dried completely." Moving with the fluid grace that characterized his investigations, Holmes traced an invisible line from the window toward the scaffolding, pausing occasionally to examine the gravel path with his lens. "2 sets of footprints, Watson, though the fog and morning dew have obscured much. One man of considerable weight, wearing hobnailed boots worn at the outer edge, suggesting a sailor's gait. The other lighter, more careful in his movements, possibly supervisory in nature. As we approached the scaffolding itself, Holmes suddenly stooped among the laurel bushes and retrieved a small, glinting fragment. "Glass, Watson, but not from any window. Note the thickness and the distinctive green tint. This is from a cheap spirit bottle, broken deliberately if I'm not mistaken." He held the shard to what little light penetrated the fog. "The edges are sharp and fresh. If Miss Ashford heard breaking glass at midnight, it was this that roused her, not any disturbance within the study itself. A carefully timed signal, I would venture." Our return to the house brought us face to face with Miss Ashford, who had been anxiously awaiting our return. Holmes settled into a chair opposite her in the drawing-room, his manner becoming more focused and urgent. "Miss Ashford, I must ask you to recall yesterday evening with absolute precision. You mentioned your uncle received unusual correspondence. Can you describe his reaction in greater detail?" She pressed her hands together, concentrating deeply. "When James brought the morning post, Uncle Theodore was taking his breakfast in the dining room. I heard him exclaim something under his breath when he opened that particular letter, something about the past refusing to stay buried. He seemed genuinely shaken, though he attempted to conceal it when I inquired about his distress." And the evening visit from Mr. Percival Dunn? That was most unusual, Mr. Holmes. Mr. Dunn appeared quite unexpectedly around 7 o'clock, claiming urgent business that could not wait until morning. What struck me as particularly odd was that he carried a worn leather satchel of foreign manufacture, which he clutched rather protectively. Yet when he departed nearly an hour later, he left empty-handed. The satchel had simply vanished. Holmes exchanged a meaningful glance with Inspector Lestrade, who had been taking careful notes throughout our investigation. "James," Holmes called to the butler, "this satchel that Mr. Dunn carried, you observed it closely?" "Indeed, sir. Quite distinctive it was, with brass fittings and what appeared to be Eastern script embossed upon the leather. Mr. Dunn seemed most reluctant to let it out of his sight, taking it with him into the study. Yet, as Miss Evangeline noted, he departed without it, though I heard no sound suggesting he had left anything behind." Returning once more to the study, Holmes conducted a more thorough examination of the desk area, his attention drawn to the crystal paperweight and the surrounding papers. From the ash tray, he extracted a tiny cone of grey ash with a yellowed ring of paper clinging to it. A cheroot, Watson, rolled coarse and bound with cheap dye, not of English manufacture, but rather the type one finds in the markets of Calcutta or Bombay. The air above the desk still carried a faint, exotic fragrance that Holmes identified immediately. "Sandalwood, Watson. The foreign correspondence James mentioned was indeed from the East and recently opened. The scent lingers in the very wood of the desk." As we prepared to depart for Mr. Dunn's office, Holmes paused in the entrance hall, his attention drawn to faint traces of dried mud near the door. Despite James's assertion that the floors had been cleaned the previous afternoon, these traces were clearly recent. Holmes knelt to examine them more closely, finally scraping a small sample into an envelope. "Red clay, Watson, quite distinctive and not found naturally in London soil. Our Mr. Dunn brought more than urgent business to this house yesterday evening. This clay suggests recent travel to regions where such soil is common, possibly the docks area where Eastern goods are unloaded. The journey to Mr. Dunn's office took us through increasingly narrow and fog-shrouded streets toward the Thames, where the maritime atmosphere grew more pronounced with each turn. The building that housed Dunn's business proved to be a respectable structure wedged between commercial establishments, its windows barely visible through the persistent fog. Mr. Percival Dunn himself was a man of stout build and florid complexion, who rose with evident surprise when we were announced. His initial expression of shock at news of his partner's disappearance seemed genuine, though Holmes observed him with that particular intensity reserved for potential suspects. "Mr. Ashford seemed in excellent spirits when I saw him yesterday," Dunn explained, settling behind his mahogany desk. "Perhaps a trifle preoccupied with a recent shipment from Calcutta, but nothing that suggested any distress. Our conversation was purely business concerning prospects for a new trade route." Holmes's eyes swept across the office, taking in every detail with characteristic thoroughness. His gaze settled upon a small, intricately carved wooden box on a corner shelf, which he approached with studied casualness. "A fine piece of craftsmanship, Mr. Dunn. Indian, I presume?" "Indeed, a gift from Theodore many years ago when he returned from his service in the East, a small token of our friendship from more adventurous days." Dunn's voice carried a note of genuine nostalgia, though Holmes observed him carefully as he examined the box. As Holmes turned the carved box over in his hands, his thumb brushed against what appeared to be a faint scratch on its lacquered surface, barely visible unless one knew where to look. He replaced it precisely where he had found it, but I noted the slight tightening around his eyes that indicated significant interest. "You mentioned Mr. Ashford received unusual correspondence yesterday," Holmes continued. "Did he make any comment upon its contents?" only that it was a ghost from the past, and that he would deal with it in his own time. Theodore often used such dramatic turns of phrase, you understand. I thought nothing of it at the time, though in light of recent events. Dunn's voice trailed off meaningfully. As we prepared to leave, Holmes made one final observation that would prove significant. Mr. Dunn, I noticed traces of red clay upon your boots. Recent travel to the docks, perhaps? Dunn glanced down with apparent surprise. Indeed, Mr. Holmes, I inspected a shipment yesterday afternoon. The wharves can be quite muddy, even in dry weather. Our departure from Dunn's office led us directly to Theodore Ashford's business premises, where Miss Ashford had insisted upon accompanying us with the necessary keys. The building near the custom house was modest but respectable, though the fog seemed even thicker here, carrying with it the mingled scents of tar, spices, and the Thames itself. The office on the second floor reflected Ashford's methodical nature, with rows of filing cabinets labelled in his precise handwriting. However, Holmes immediately detected signs of recent disturbance, despite the overall appearance of order. "Someone has been here before us, Watson," he announced, examining the central desk drawer with his magnifying glass. "The lock has been picked with considerable skill, and recently observe these fresh scratches on the metal and the traces of oil used to silence the mechanism during the operation." As Inspector Lestrade moved to examine the windows, and I began searching through the remaining papers, Holmes discovered that several files were missing from their expected locations. The fog outside made it impossible to determine if we were being observed, but the sense of unseen eyes watching our investigation had grown increasingly pronounced throughout the day. "The game grows more complex, Watson," Holmes murmured as we concluded our examination. "We have foreign correspondence, vanishing satchels, skilled burglary, and enough red herrings to stock a fishmonger's stall. Yet the pattern begins to emerge like shapes forming in this infernal fog. Our next step must be to determine exactly what Mr. Ashford discovered in that Eastern letter, and why it cost him his freedom, if not his life." Our departure from Ashford's office led us through increasingly narrow streets toward the Thames, where Holmes intended to investigate the recent Calcutta shipment that had so occupied both partners' attention. The fog seemed to thicken with each step eastward, transforming the familiar landmarks of London into ghostly suggestions that appeared and vanished like memories half recalled. "Watson," Holmes said as we navigated the treacherous cobblestones, "observe how our investigation has revealed a curious temporal pattern. Yesterday morning brings disturbing correspondence from the East. Afternoon sees Mr. Dunn at the docks, returning with his mysterious satchel. Evening brings his urgent visit to his partner, departing empty-handed. By midnight, both letter and satchel have vanished along with Mr. Ashford himself. The sequence suggests not random crime, but methodical retrieval of specific items. The London docks emerged from the fog like a scene from some maritime purgatory, the skeletal masts of merchant vessels disappearing into the grey void above our heads. The mingled scents of tar, exotic spices, and the Thames itself created an atmosphere both familiar and ominous. Holmes led us directly to the harbour-master's office, where his reputation preceded him sufficiently to gain immediate cooperation. "The Calcutta Dawn arrived 3 days past," the harbour-master explained, consulting his ledgers with practised efficiency. "Standard cargo for Mr. Ashford's account, but there was something irregular. A private consignment, sealed with red wax and bearing specific instructions for personal collection only. Mr. Dunn himself came yesterday afternoon, seemed quite eager to complete the transaction." Holmes leaned forward with evident interest. "Can you describe this consignment?" "A wooden crate, perhaps 2 feet square, bearing Eastern markings. Heavy for its size, and the gentleman handled it with considerable care." paid the storage fees and departed immediately, though I noted he seemed nervous, constantly glancing about as if expecting unwelcome attention. Returning to our cab, Holmes directed the driver back toward Baker Street, but made an unexpected stop at a small shop that specialized in Eastern antiquities. The proprietor, a scholarly gentleman named Mr. Whitmore, examined the fragment of red wax Holmes had preserved from Ashford's study. "Excellent quality sealing wax," Whitmore observed through his magnifying glass. "The impression, though partial, appears to be that of an elephant within a wreath of lotus blossoms." Such seals are typically used by established merchant houses in Bengal, particularly those dealing in precious objects or sensitive documents. As we finally arrived at Baker Street, Holmes immediately ascended to his study and retrieved a small spirit lamp from his chemical apparatus. "Watson, there is one avenue of investigation we have not yet explored. Mr. Ashford's blotting paper may yet yield secrets that escaped our initial examination." With characteristic precision, Holmes angled the blotting book toward the window and passed the flame beneath the paper without allowing it to touch. Gradually, as if conjured from the very air, faint, reversed impressions began to appear upon the fibers. Holmes traced the emerging letters with his pencil, connecting curves and strokes until recognizable words materialized. "Fascinating," he murmured, his eyes bright with satisfaction. "Old Wapping Stairs Midnight Return Ledger. The appointment was made, Watson, though whether Mr. Ashford intended to keep it remains to be seen." Inspector Lestrade arrived as Holmes was completing his examination of the blotting paper, his face bearing an expression of grim satisfaction. "Mr. Holmes, my inquiries have borne fruit. Mr. Dunn's financial situation is far more precarious than his outward success would suggest. His recent ventures have been stretched thin, and there are whispers of debts to some rather unsavory characters from his past." "And what manner of past associates might these be, Inspector?" "Men who served with him in India, Mr. Holmes. It appears both Ashford and Dunn were involved in some incident during their military service, something that required diplomatic intervention to resolve quietly. The details remain sealed, but the implications are clear enough." Holmes nodded thoughtfully, though I detected that familiar reserve in his manner that suggested deeper contemplation. "The evidence against Mr. Dunn accumulates with remarkable consistency, Inspector, perhaps too remarkable for my complete satisfaction. As evening approached, Holmes announced his intention to observe the midnight rendezvous at Old Wapping Stairs, though he insisted upon doing so from concealment rather than direct confrontation. If someone intends to return a ledger tonight, Watson, I prefer to learn their identity before revealing our own interest in the matter." The journey to Wapping through the fog-shrouded streets proved both treacherous and atmospheric, our cab moving at little more than walking pace as the driver navigated by memory and instinct. The ancient stairs, when we finally located them, descended into the Thames like stone fingers reaching into the dark water, their surfaces slick with moisture and age. Holmes positioned us in the shadows of a nearby warehouse, from where we could observe the stairs without being detected. The fog provided excellent concealment, though it also limited our visibility to mere yards in any direction. The sound of water lapping against stone and the distant foghorns of river traffic created an almost supernatural atmosphere as we settled in to wait. "Watson," Holmes whispered, as we took our positions, "whatever transpires tonight, remember that the obvious solution is often merely the most convenient screen for a more complex truth. Mr. Dunn may indeed be guilty of something, but whether that something is the disappearance of Theodore Ashford remains to be proven." As the hours passed and midnight approached, the fog seemed to thicken further, transforming our vigil into something resembling a scene from Gothic literature. The ancient stairs disappeared into the mist below, while the Thames itself became merely a suggestion of movement and sound in the darkness. Whatever secrets the night might reveal, I felt certain that our patient observation would yield insights that direct confrontation could never provide. The game, as Holmes would say, was most definitely afoot, though the true nature of our quarry remained as obscured as the fog-shrouded river before us. The church bells of Wapping had long since struck midnight, when the first sound distinguished itself from the river's eternal murmur against stone. Holmes's hand found my sleeve in silent warning as the rhythmic creak of oarlocks emerged from the fog-shrouded Thames, growing steadily clearer through the impenetrable grey veil that had transformed London into a city of phantoms. A dark shape materialized upon the water, resolving gradually into a small rowing boat that moved with practiced stealth along the current. Two figures occupied the craft, one bent over the oars with the economy of movement that spoke of long familiarity with these treacherous waters, while the other crouched forward, clutching what appeared to be a wrapped bundle against his chest. The oarsman shipped his blades with expert precision, allowing the tide to carry them the final yards until the boat's nose kissed the slime-covered stones with barely a whisper. The passenger sprang ashore with surprising agility, his boots ringing against the ancient granite with the distinctive sound of hobnailed soles worn at the outer edge. Even through the concealing fog I could observe the heavy set of his shoulders and the deliberate nature of his movements as he ascended 3 steps from the water's edge. "The sailor returns to complete his appointed task," Holmes breathed, his voice barely audible above the lapping water. The man paused at the 3rd step, kneeling with practiced efficiency to examine the mortar between the stones. There came a faint grating sound as his fingers found some hidden mechanism, and a thin section of the step shifted beneath his manipulation. From within his coat, he withdrew the bundle and pressed it carefully into the revealed cavity, his movements suggesting this was a procedure he had performed before. The stone slid back into place with barely a sound. From the boat below came an urgent whisper in what sounded like Bengali, though the fog distorted the words beyond clear comprehension. The heavy man turned his head toward his companion, then began his descent back to the water's edge. Within moments, both figures had vanished into the grey void from which they had emerged, leaving only the gentle splash of oars growing fainter in the distance. Holmes waited with characteristic patience until the sounds had completely faded before rising from our concealment. Moving with the silent grace of a hunting cat, he led us down the treacherous steps, testing each foothold carefully in the uncertain light. At the 3rd riser, he paused and ran his fingers along the mortar line until he located the mechanism the stranger had manipulated. A section of stone, cunningly disguised to appear part of the original construction, moved beneath his pressure to reveal a narrow cavity carved into the step itself. From within, Holmes withdrew a package wrapped in oiled canvas and bound with hemp rope, the same tarred fibre we had discovered in Ashford's study window. "The appointment has been kept," he murmured, examining the knots with his magnifying glass despite the poor light. "Note the distinctive binding, Watson. This ropework shows the hand of a man trained in maritime practices, but the pattern is not English. Observe how the final securing loop passes beneath rather than over the primary binding." As Holmes carefully loosened the wrapping, the unmistakable scent of sandalwood rose from within, confirming the Eastern origin we had suspected. However, before he could examine the contents fully, the sound of approaching footsteps echoed from the cobblestones above, accompanied by the low murmur of voices engaged in urgent conversation. "Quickly, Watson," Holmes whispered, rewrapping the package with swift efficiency. "We have lingered too long at this particular stage." We retreated deeper into the shadows as 3 figures emerged from the fog, their movements betraying considerable familiarity with these dangerous riverside paths. The leader carried a shuttered lantern that cast only the faintest glow, while his companions moved with the careful precision of men accustomed to working in darkness. The delivery was to be completed by now, one voice complained, carrying a distinct accent that Holmes immediately identified as originating from the Indian subcontinent. If the package has not been properly placed, our entire arrangement becomes compromised. "Patience, Gupta," replied another voice, this one bearing the refined tones of English education despite its foreign origin. "The fog provides excellent cover for our purposes, but it also demands careful timing. The retrieval will proceed as planned." From our concealment, we watched as the three men descended to examine the very step where Holmes had discovered the hidden cache. Their evident familiarity with the location confirmed that this clandestine postal system had been in operation for some time, serving purposes that extended far beyond tonight's single transaction. The leader produced a small brass token from his pocket, its surface bearing what appeared to be the crude impression of a rampant lion. As he inserted this into some mechanism within the stone, I noticed traces of green paint upon his fingers, the same distinctive hue Holmes had discovered earlier in our investigation. "The package has been collected," the man announced with evident satisfaction. "Our mysterious benefactor has honored his commitment, though I confess curiosity about his ultimate intentions." "Such curiosity has proven dangerous in the past," warned the third member of their group. "The company's reach extends far beyond the boundaries of empire, and old debts have a way of demanding payment when least expected." As the three men prepared to depart, Holmes made careful note of their physical characteristics and manner of speech, though the fog prevented clear observation of their faces. Their reference to the company provided another piece of the complex puzzle we were assembling, while their obvious professional competence suggested adversaries worthy of serious consideration. Once their footsteps had faded completely into the fog-shrouded streets, Holmes emerged from concealment with the wrapped package secure beneath his coat. "The game grows more intricate with each development, Watson," he observed, as we began our careful ascent from the river. "We have witnessed the operation of what appears to be an established network for clandestine communication, complete with recognition tokens and predetermined procedures. Our return journey through the fog-bound streets provided opportunity for Holmes to examine our prize more thoroughly. The package contained not the ledger we had expected, but rather a collection of documents written in multiple hands and bearing various official seals. Several pages appeared to be copies of military dispatches, while others resembled commercial correspondence of the type maintained by trading companies operating in the Far East. "Most illuminating," Holmes murmured, as we finally reached the relative safety of Baker Street. "Mr. Ashford's mysterious disappearance has revealed the existence of a sophisticated intelligence network with connections reaching back to his service in India. The question now becomes whether he is victim or participant in whatever scheme these documents represent." The fog that had concealed tonight's activities seemed symbolic of the mystery itself, providing cover for secrets that extended far beyond a simple case of missing persons. As we settled before our fire to examine the recovered documents more thoroughly, I could not escape the feeling that we had stumbled upon something far more significant than the disappearance of a single shipping agent, however mysterious the circumstances might appear. The warmth of our Baker Street sitting room provided welcome refuge from the fog-shrouded mysteries of the Thames, as Holmes arranged the recovered documents across his desk with characteristic precision. The gaslight revealed papers of varying quality and provenance, some bearing the distinctive watermarks of official correspondence, while others showed the rougher texture of commercial invoices. Each had been carefully preserved in oiled silk, suggesting their continued importance to parties with considerable resources and infinite patience. Holmes began his examination with the methodical approach that had served him so well in countless investigations grouping the papers by watermark, handwriting, and official seals. One collection bore the elephant within lotus blossom seal we had encountered before, while another consisted of memoranda written in the cultivated English hand that spoke of military rather than mercantile origins. His magnifying glass revealed numbered folios that leaped mysteriously from 14 to 17, suggesting pages had been deliberately removed. "Watson, observe the chronology of these documents," he announced, arranging them in apparent date order. The earliest bears the seal of the East India Company and is dated 1863, while the most recent carries yesterday's date. We are examining nearly 3 decades of carefully preserved correspondence, all relating to what appears to be a single, ongoing matter of considerable delicacy. The oldest document proved to be a military dispatch describing the mysterious disappearance of a supply convoy near Calcutta, along with its escort of company soldiers. The cargo manifest listed standard military provisions, but marginal notes in faded ink suggested the true contents were far more valuable than mere rice and ammunition. Holmes held the paper to the light, revealing a watermark bearing the distinctive crown and anchor of official correspondence. "Here we find the genesis of our current mystery," he declared, his finger tracing the relevant passages. Lieutenant Theodore Ashford and Sergeant Percival Dunn were among the survivors of an ambush that claimed 17 lives and resulted in the loss of what the official report describes as sensitive materials vital to company interests in the region. The language suggests something far more significant than ordinary military supplies. Subsequent documents revealed a pattern of increasing desperation as company officials attempted to recover both the stolen materials and identify those responsible for the ambush. Several letters bore the signature of Colonel James Morrison, whose increasingly urgent tone suggested personal as well as professional stakes in the resolution of the matter. One dispatch, its tone icily bureaucratic, described a punitive raid upon a village near the Hooghly following the theft of company stores, with casualties listed as undetermined and the matter closed by direction. "Note the signatures masked by initials," Holmes observed, "but they recur throughout our collection, beside lists of remittances described as compensation in one place, retainers in another. The pattern suggests systematic corruption extending far beyond a simple military disaster." A commercial letter provided crucial context, written by a Calcutta merchant named Rajesh Gupta to his London representative. It described the arrival of certain historical documents that had become available through unofficial channels, with careful phrasing that suggested items obtained through questionable means. The substantial sums mentioned indicated their considerable value to interested parties with deep pockets and deeper secrets. "The same Gupta whose voice we heard tonight at the river stairs," Holmes noted with evident satisfaction. "Our mysterious network has maintained operations for 3 decades, suggesting both remarkable patience and substantial resources. The question becomes whether Mr. Ashford was blackmailer or victim in this extended drama." Holmes paused over one document whose revelations cast new light upon our entire investigation. "A ledger is referenced throughout these papers," he observed, tapping several passages where the words "See Return Ledger B" appeared in abbreviated form. "Our package represents an index to a greater transgression, not the transgression itself. The ledger remains missing, and more importantly, it was never meant to pass through Wapping tonight." His eyes suddenly brightened with that familiar spark of deductive triumph. "Watson, we must return immediately to the Ashford residence. I detected disturbance among the hearthstones this morning, yet Miss Ashford noted no sounds of concealment during Dunn's visit. The satchel he carried contained more than urgent correspondence." Our return journey through fog-shrouded London proved both treacherous and contemplative, the persistent grey veil seeming to press closer with each passing hour. James admitted us without question, his relief at our return evident despite his professional composure. Miss Ashford, wrapped in a dark robe and bearing the strain of sleepless worry, greeted us with desperate hope. Holmes proceeded directly to the study, ignoring desk and windows alike in favour of the fireplace he had examined earlier. Producing a thin-bladed knife, he probed the joint between two stones until a muted scrape indicated success. The nearer slab rose upon a cunningly concealed hinge to reveal a cavity cut deep within the foundation itself. From within, Holmes withdrew a worn leather satchel whose brass corners gleamed in the lamplight. "Mr. Dunn's treasure," he announced, carrying it to the desk with almost reverent care. "Observe the Eastern embossing, James. Your memory serves you excellently." The satchel contained a narrow, calf-bound volume whose spine showed the wear of years and whose edges had darkened from much handling. Holmes opened it carefully, revealing neat columns of entries extending back 2 decades. Names had been reduced to initials or sobriquets, while notations recorded amounts dispersed in pounds, rupees, and occasionally more exotic forms of payment. In the margin of a recent page, a smear of familiar green paint marked the paper. "Here we have confirmation," Holmes declared, his finger halting at an entry dated 3 days past. A transfer in full acquittance directed to a party identified only as E against a debt arising from the affair of Chandernagore. The sum involved would bankrupt Mr. Dunn if paid immediately. Before I could respond to this revelation, rapid footsteps upon our stairs announced an urgent visitor. Inspector Lestrade entered without ceremony, his weathered face bearing an expression that mixed professional satisfaction with genuine concern. "Mr. Holmes, developments have occurred that cast our investigation in an entirely new light," he announced, breathlessly. "A body has been discovered in the Thames near Rotherhithe, bearing papers identifying him as one Rajesh Gupta, recently arrived from Calcutta. The circumstances strongly suggest foul play, though this infernal fog has complicated our examination of the scene." Holmes rose with laser-like focus, his attention immediately engaged. "The timing proves too convenient for coincidence, Inspector. How long has the body been in the water?" "The police surgeon estimates no more than 6 hours, placing death around midnight. There are clear signs of violence, though the river has obscured much evidence. More significantly, the deceased carried this upon his person." Lestrade produced a brass token identical to the one we had observed at the river stairs. "Then our mysterious network has suffered significant disruption," Holmes observed, examining the token with his magnifying glass. "The question becomes whether Mr. Gupta's death resulted from internal conflict or external intervention by parties unknown to us." As Holmes secured the recovered documents and ledger in his strongbox, his expression grew increasingly grave. "Watson, we stand at a crucial juncture. Gupta's murder suggests someone is systematically eliminating participants in this conspiracy, while the timing indicates our own activities may have accelerated events beyond anyone's control." The implications of our discoveries weighed heavily as we prepared to examine this latest development. What had begun as the disappearance of a respectable shipping agent had evolved into something approaching international intrigue, with roots reaching back to the darkest corners of imperial administration and consequences that now included murder. "The fog that has concealed so much may soon lift," Holmes observed as we prepared to depart. "When it does, I suspect we shall discover that Mr. Ashford's disappearance was merely the opening move in a deadly game that has already claimed one life. Our task now becomes preventing further casualties while unraveling 3 decades of carefully maintained deception before the body count rises higher still. The journey to Rotherhithe through London's fog-shrouded streets proved both urgent and ominous, our hansom cab moving with deliberate caution through the grey veil that seemed to press closer with each passing hour. Holmes sat in contemplative silence, the recovered ledger secure within his coat, while his fingers drummed against his knee with that particular rhythm I had learned to associate with accelerated deductive processes. The persistent fog had transformed our familiar city into an alien landscape where familiar landmarks appeared and vanished like half-remembered dreams. The Thames at Rotherhithe presented a scene of controlled investigation, with police lanterns casting eerie circles of illumination through the impenetrable mist, while constables moved about their grim duties with professional efficiency. Body of Rajesh Gupta lay upon a trestle table within a riverside warehouse covered by a tarpaulin that could not entirely conceal the violence that had ended his life. Holmes approached with that characteristic detachment that enabled him to extract maximum information from even the most disturbing crime scenes. "Observe the precision of the wounds, Watson," he announced, lifting the covering to reveal deep puncture marks beneath the victim's ribs. A narrow blade, perhaps 6 inches in length, wielded by someone with considerable anatomical knowledge. The angle of entry suggests our killer struck upward with surgical precision, ensuring immediate incapacitation. His magnifying glass revealed additional details invisible to casual observation. Note the faint ligature marks high upon the throat, not from strangulation, but from something used to control his movements during the final moments. The examination of Gupta's clothing and personal effects proved equally revealing. His coat bore traces of the same red clay we had discovered at various points throughout our investigation, while his fingernails contained fragments of green paint that matched samples Holmes had collected earlier. Most significantly, his pockets had been systematically searched with professional thoroughness, their contents arranged to suggest robbery while actually concealing more specific objectives. "The timing troubles me greatly, Inspector," Holmes observed as we moved away from the immediate crime scene. Gupta's death occurred within hours of our observation at Wapping Stairs, yet the precision of the killing suggests long-term planning rather than hasty improvisation. Someone anticipated his movements with remarkable accuracy, which implies either betrayal within their organization or surveillance by parties previously unknown to us. Our return to Belgravia led us once again to examine the scaffolding that had played such a crucial role in Ashford's mysterious disappearance. Holmes mounted the wooden framework with feline agility, his keen eyes detecting evidence that had escaped earlier observation. Along one horizontal beam that aligned perfectly with the study windows, he discovered traces of tarred rope and the distinctive wear marks left by a pulley system. "The locked room mystery resolves itself through simple mechanical ingenuity," he declared, tracing the path an escape rope would have taken. They secured a line from this beam to the window frame, allowing Mr. Ashford to traverse the gap under cover of fog. The sound Miss Ashford heard was not breaking glass within the study, but rather the prearranged signal that marked the completion of their operation. The foreman's records revealed that a casual labourer named Elijah Crowe had been employed for the past 3 days, but had failed to appear for work following the night of Ashford's disappearance. A tin of green paint bore the clear impression of a thumb, while the pattern of its use suggested someone familiar with both the building's layout and the household's evening routines. Holmes's examination of the study's interior revealed additional evidence of careful preparation. The crystal paperweight on Ashford's desk showed microscopic scratches, suggesting recent use as a signal device, while the arrangement of papers indicated someone had spent considerable time preparing for the evening's events. Most tellingly, traces of sandalwood lingered in the very wood of the desk, confirming that the mysterious Eastern correspondence had been opened and studied extensively before the night's dramatic conclusion. "Watson, we stand at the convergence of multiple conspiracies," Holmes announced as we prepared to depart. "The 30-year-old secrets of the Chandernagore affair, the systematic elimination of witnesses, and Mr. Ashford's own carefully orchestrated disappearance have combined to create a situation of extraordinary complexity. Gupta's murder suggests someone is accelerating the timeline, forcing resolution through violence rather than negotiation." As we returned to Baker Street through the persistent fog, Holmes outlined his growing understanding of the case's true dimensions. The recovered ledger represented not merely evidence of financial impropriety, but a comprehensive record of imperial corruption extending into the highest levels of government and commerce. The systematic payments recorded over 3 decades suggested not simple blackmail, but rather a complex arrangement that had maintained stability through carefully balanced obligations and mutual assured destruction. "The fog that has concealed so much will soon lift," Holmes observed with characteristic prescience. "When it does, I suspect we shall discover that Mr. Ashford's disappearance was neither kidnapping nor murder, but rather the opening gambit in a deadly endgame that has already claimed one life and threatens to claim many more before its conclusion." The implications of our discoveries weighed heavily as we contemplated the next phase of our investigation. What had begun as a simple missing person case had evolved into something approaching international intrigue, with roots reaching back to the darkest corners of imperial administration and consequences that now included professional assassination. The game, as Holmes would say, had entered its most dangerous phase, where a single miscalculation could prove fatal to all concerned. The grey dawn found Holmes seated at his desk in our Baker Street sitting room, the recovered ledger open before him, and the mysterious documents arranged with mathematical precision across the mahogany surface. He had not slept, his restless energy channeled into intensive analysis of the 30-year chronicle of corruption that lay spread beneath the gaslight. Twice during the night I had observed him consulting his extensive files on colonial administration, cross-referencing names and dates with the methodical thoroughness that characterized his most complex investigations. "Watson," he announced as I entered with our morning coffee, "observe these entries from the summer of 1863, substantial payments to parties identified only by initials, but the timing corresponds precisely with the Chandernagore massacre referenced in our recovered documents. The amounts suggest not mere compensation, but systematic elimination of witnesses through financial inducement rather than physical violence." Before I could respond to this revelation, Mrs. Hudson's urgent knock interrupted our consultation. "Mr. Holmes, there's a gentleman from the War Office below, accompanied by a young lady in considerable distress. Both insist the matter cannot wait, and the gentleman bears official credentials." The visitors proved to be Colonel James Morrison, a spare man of military bearing whose weathered features spoke of long service in distant climates, and Miss Sarah Whitmore, a plainly dressed woman of perhaps 25 years, whose evident terror could not entirely mask the intelligence that burned in her dark eyes. Morrison presented his card with ceremonious precision, while Miss Whitmore clutched a sealed envelope with hands that trembled despite her obvious efforts at self-control. "Mr. Holmes," Morrison began, his voice carrying the clipped authority of long command, "you possess documents of grave importance to the Empire. They were unlawfully abstracted from official custody and have remained beyond proper oversight for 3 decades. I am authorized to recover them quietly for reasons that extend far beyond simple administrative irregularity." Holmes regarded the colonel with that penetrating stare that had unnerved countless suspects. "Your authority is noted, Colonel, but I have before me the murder of Rajesh Gupta and the mysterious disappearance of Theodore Ashford. Until those matters are resolved, the documents remain where they are safest. Miss Whitmore stepped forward with sudden courage. Mr. Holmes, I am employed as a clerk in the offices of Morrison, Hartwell and Associates, solicitors specializing in colonial affairs. Yesterday evening, I discovered correspondence that places not only my life, but Mr. Ashford's in mortal danger. This envelope was thrust beneath our office door at midnight, bearing instructions that chilled my blood. Holmes accepted the envelope with characteristic delicacy, examining the paper and seal before breaking it open. His eyes moved rapidly across the contents, and I observed that familiar tightening around his features that indicated significant concern. "The ransom demand," he announced, holding the letter where both Morrison and I could observe its contents. "Bring the return ledger B to Greenwich Observatory at 8 this evening. Come alone and unarmed. The gentleman whose welfare concerns you will be exchanged in good order if you obey. Where the Thames meets the sky, truth waits beneath stone." Colonel Morrison's face had grown increasingly grave during Holmes's recitation. "Mr. Holmes, you must understand that this ledger represents more than simple financial irregularity. The Chandernagore affair involved the systematic looting of temple treasures under cover of military necessity. The profits were divided among a syndicate that included officials at the highest levels of colonial administration. Exposure would destroy careers, topple governments, and potentially destabilize our entire position in the East." Holmes rose and moved to the window, gazing out at the fog that still clung to the London streets, despite the advancing morning. "Colonel, your concern for imperial stability is noted, but I suspect the true threat lies not in exposure of past corruption, but in the systematic elimination of witnesses that has already claimed one life and threatens to claim others." Miss Whitmore's account provided crucial confirmation of Holmes's growing theory. Morrison, Hartwell and Associates had maintained extensive files on the Chandernagore participants, including detailed correspondence with parties whose names appeared throughout the recovered ledger. More significantly, the firm had recently received instructions to liquidate certain assets and transfer the proceeds to Swiss accounts, suggesting preparation for hasty departure from England. "The pattern becomes clear," Holmes declared, turning from the window with renewed energy. Mr. Ashford's disappearance was not kidnapping but strategic withdrawal. The locked room, the mysterious letter, the breaking glass, all elements of an elaborate deception designed to create the appearance of supernatural intervention while concealing very human methods of escape. His analysis, delivered with characteristic precision, revealed the true complexity of the situation. The scaffolding had provided the means of egress, with Elijah Crowe serving as accomplice rather than abductor. The tarred rope we had discovered, the green paint traces, the carefully timed signal, all confirmed that Ashford had orchestrated his own disappearance upon learning of the conspiracy's intention to eliminate him permanently. "But why the elaborate charade?" I inquired, though I suspected Holmes had already deduced the answer. "Because, Watson, Mr. Ashford understood that his only protection lay in making himself more valuable alive than dead. The ledger represents not merely evidence of past corruption, but a comprehensive record of ongoing operations that extend far beyond the original Chandernagore affair. By disappearing while apparently under threat, he forced his enemies into the open while maintaining control of the situation." Colonel Morrison's expression had grown increasingly troubled during Holmes's exposition. "Mr. Holmes, if your deductions are correct, then we face a situation far more dangerous than simple blackmail. The syndicate you describe has evolved into something approaching a shadow government with resources and connections that extend throughout the empire." Holmes nodded grimly. "Precisely why Gupta's murder represents not random violence, but systematic elimination of potential witnesses. Someone is accelerating the timeline, forcing resolution through assassination rather than negotiation. As our visitors prepared to depart, Holmes outlined his strategy for the evening's confrontation. Rather than delivering the actual ledger to Greenwich, he proposed using a carefully prepared decoy while positioning observers to identify and apprehend those responsible for the conspiracy. The plan required precise timing and considerable risk, but offered the best opportunity to rescue Ashford while preserving the evidence necessary to bring his enemies to justice. "The fog that has concealed so much begins to lift," Holmes observed as Colonel Morrison and Miss Whitmore took their leave. "Tonight, at Greenwich Observatory, we shall discover whether Mr. Ashford's gamble has preserved his life or merely delayed his inevitable fate. Either way, Watson, the game enters its final phase, where 30 years of carefully maintained secrets will finally demand their reckoning." The afternoon brought final preparations for what promised to be the most dangerous confrontation of our investigation. Holmes spent considerable time preparing the decoy ledger, incorporating subtle markers that would identify anyone who handled it, while I reviewed our weapons and considered the tactical challenges posed by the Greenwich location. The fog continued to thin throughout the day, suggesting that tonight's events would unfold under clearer skies than we had experienced since the case began. "Remember, Watson," Holmes said as evening approached, "we seek not merely to rescue Mr. Ashford, but to expose a conspiracy that has operated with impunity for 3 decades. The stakes extend far beyond a single life, though that life remains precious to those who love him." As darkness fell and the appointed hour approached, I could not escape the feeling that we stood at the threshold of revelations that would forever change our understanding of the case that had begun with a simple missing person report. The game, as Holmes would say, was about to reach its most critical phase, where a single miscalculation could prove fatal to all concerned. The journey to Greenwich Observatory through London's gradually clearing streets marked a dramatic transformation in the atmospheric conditions that had dominated our investigation from its inception. The fog that had concealed so much was finally beginning to lift, revealing familiar landmarks that had been reduced to ghostly suggestions for the past 3 days. Holmes sat in contemplative silence beside me, the carefully prepared decoy ledger secured within his coat, while his keen eyes observed every detail of our route with that particular intensity that preceded his most dangerous confrontations. Our hansom cab deposited us at the base of Greenwich Hill as the evening shadows lengthened across the Thames Valley below. The Royal Observatory stood silhouetted against the darkening sky like a monument to precision and scientific inquiry, its distinctive dome and buildings commanding an unobstructed view across the river toward the distant spires of London. Holmes had chosen our approach with characteristic calculation, positioning us to observe the entire site while remaining concealed among the ancient trees that dotted the hillside. "Watson," he murmured, as we took our positions, "observe how the clearing atmosphere has transformed our tactical situation. The fog that provided cover for so much deception now abandons our adversaries to clear observation, while the elevated position offers excellent sight lines in all directions. Tonight, 30 years of carefully maintained secrets will finally demand their reckoning." Inspector Lestrade and 3 carefully selected constables had taken concealed positions around the observatory grounds, their presence invisible to casual observation, but positioned to respond swiftly to Holmes's signal. The plan required delicate timing, as premature action might endanger Ashford's life, while delay could allow the conspirators to escape with their prize. Holmes had prepared the decoy ledger with meticulous attention to detail, incorporating subtle markers that would identify anyone who handled it while appearing identical to the original volume. As 8 o'clock approached, 3 figures emerged from the shadows near the observatory's main building, moving with the deliberate precision of men accustomed to clandestine operations. The leader's bearing immediately caught my attention, his military posture and authoritative manner unmistakably familiar despite the distance and uncertain light. Even before he stepped into the pale moonlight, I recognized the spare frame and commanding presence of Colonel James Morrison. So our helpful War Office representative reveals his true allegiance, Holmes observed quietly, his eyes tracking the movements below with predatory focus. Note how he positions his companions to control all approaches while maintaining clear retreat routes. This is not his first such operation. Morrison's companions flanked him with professional efficiency, one maintaining watch on the approaches, while the other remained near what appeared to be a 4th figure seated on a stone bench near the meridian line. Even at distance, the slumped posture and apparent restraints identified this as Theodore Ashford, though his precise condition remained unclear through the gathering darkness. Holmes began his descent toward the meeting point with measured steps, the decoy satchel visible in his left hand while his right remained free for swift action. His movements projected the confidence of a man keeping an unwelcome appointment, though I knew his senses remained alert to every detail of the surrounding environment. The clearing air carried sounds with unusual clarity, allowing us to hear the distinctive ring of hobnailed boots against stone as one of Morrison's men adjusted his position. "Mr. Holmes," Morrison called as my friend drew within conversational distance, his voice carrying the same clipped authority we had heard in our Baker Street sitting room. "You are punctual, though I confess surprise at your compliance with our requirements. I had expected more elaborate resistance from a man of your reputation." "The circumstances leave little room for negotiation, Colonel," Holmes replied, his tone carefully neutral. "Mr. Ashford's welfare takes precedence over any personal considerations. You have the advantage of position and numbers." Morrison gestured toward the seated figure, and I observed Ashford raise his head with evident effort. Despite his restraints and obvious distress, his eyes held an alertness that suggested greater awareness of his situation than his captors might realize. The sight confirmed that he had indeed survived his mysterious disappearance, though the circumstances of his captivity remained troubling. "The ledger for the gentleman," Morrison announced, his manner suggesting a transaction rather than negotiation. "Place it upon the meridian marker and withdraw to a safe distance. Any deviation from these instructions will prove unfortunate for all concerned." Holmes advanced with apparent compliance, though his keen eyes catalogued every detail of the tactical situation. As he neared the designated spot, he paused with characteristic deliberation, his attention apparently caught by some detail invisible to my distant observation. "Colonel Morrison," he said suddenly, his voice carrying clearly across the observatory grounds, "I must commend your organization's thoroughness. The brass tokens, the coordinated timing, the systematic elimination of potential witnesses. However, your attention to detail has proven your undoing." Morrison's reaction was swift and telling, his hand moving instinctively toward his coat, while his eyes swept the surrounding shadows for signs of additional threats. "Mr. Holmes, you mistake efficiency for guilt. The ledger, if you please." "I think not, Colonel." Holmes withdrew something from his own pocket, holding it where the moonlight caught its metallic surface. The token bearing the rampant lion crest, identical to the one found upon Rajesh Gupta's body. Your fingers still bear traces of the distinctive green paint discovered at multiple crime scenes throughout our investigation. The revelation struck Morrison with visible force, his composed facade cracking to reveal the calculating mind beneath. His companions tensed visibly, their hands moving toward concealed weapons as the situation rapidly deteriorated from negotiation to confrontation. "You have overplayed your hand, Mr. Holmes," Morrison snarled, abandoning any pretense of diplomatic courtesy. The ledger contains information that could destabilize governments and destroy careers spanning 3 decades. Some secrets are worth any price to preserve, including murder, Colonel. Gupta's death was particularly brutal, even by the standards of imperial necessity. Holmes's voice carried the cold authority of absolute certainty. The narrow blade, the precise anatomical knowledge, the systematic search of his effects, professional work befitting a man of your background and connections. As Morrison signalled to his men, who immediately drew weapons from their coats, Theodore Ashford suddenly found his voice despite his restraints. "Mr. Holmes," he called with surprising strength, "the true ledger lies where the Thames meets the sky, as my letter indicated. What these gentlemen seek exists only in your decoy." The admission transformed our understanding of the entire situation. Ashford's apparent helplessness had concealed a deeper game, his prophetic letter containing genuine intelligence rather than supernatural prescience. Morrison's expression shifted from confidence to alarm as he realized the implications of this revelation. "The exchange was never intended to succeed," Holmes declared, his voice carrying across the observatory grounds with unmistakable triumph. "Mr. Ashford's disappearance was orchestrated to draw you into the open while preserving the evidence necessary for your prosecution. The fog that concealed so much has finally lifted, Colonel, revealing truths that 30 years of careful deception cannot obscure." Morrison's response was immediate and violent, his military training asserting itself as the situation collapsed beyond recovery. "Take them," he commanded his men, his voice carrying the authority of desperate command. "The ledger dies with Holmes, and our secrets remain buried." As weapons appeared in the moonlight, and the peaceful observatory grounds erupted into deadly confrontation, I realized that our investigation had finally reached its most dangerous phase. The game Holmes had orchestrated with such precision now balanced on the knife's edge of violence, where a single miscalculation could prove fatal to all concerned. The clearing fog had indeed revealed the truth, but that truth now demanded payment in blood before justice could finally be served. Morrison's command to "take them" shattered the tense silence across Greenwich Observatory's grounds, but Holmes had anticipated this moment with characteristic foresight. As Morrison's men advanced with drawn weapons, Holmes suddenly hurled the leather satchel toward the meridian marker with apparent compliance. The bag struck the brass plate and burst open in a cloud of brilliant violet powder that immediately stained the hands and clothing of the nearest attacker who lunged to seize it. "Aniline violet," Holmes announced with grim satisfaction as his shrill whistle pierced the night air. "A modest expedient that will mark our friends as surely as any uniform by morning's light." Inspector Lestrade and his concealed constables emerged from the shadows with military precision, their approach coordinated by Holmes's signal. The element of surprise which Morrison had so carefully cultivated throughout the conspiracy now belonged entirely to us. The violet-stained attacker stumbled backward, coughing and disoriented, while his companion found himself surrounded by uniformed officers with truncheons drawn. Morrison's response revealed both his military training and his desperation. Rather than surrender, he seized Theodore Ashford by the collar and pressed a narrow blade against his throat, the same surgical instrument that had ended Rajesh Gupta's life with such clinical precision. "The ledger, Mr. Holmes, or your client dies as messily as his Indian associate," Morrison snarled, his composed facade cracking, to reveal the ruthless pragmatist beneath. 30 years of careful arrangement will not be undone by your theatrical heroics." Holmes regarded the colonel with that penetrating stare that had unnerved countless adversaries, his grey eyes calculating distances and possibilities with mathematical precision. "Colonel Morrison, You underestimate both my preparation and Mr. Ashford's resourcefulness. Observe his bonds more carefully." Indeed, Ashford's restraints had been loosened with deliberate skill, the ropework showing the distinctive maritime pattern Holmes had noted throughout our investigation. With a deft twist that spoke of considerable nautical knowledge, Ashford slipped free of his bonds and rolled away from Morrison's blade in a single fluid motion. "The underbinding loop passes beneath rather than over," Holmes explained, as Morrison's advantage evaporated. Mr. Crow's handiwork, but loosened by prior arrangement. Your hostage was never as helpless as he appeared. Deprived of his human shield, Morrison made a desperate dash toward the observatory buildings, but Lestrade's constables had positioned themselves with professional competence. Within moments, the colonel found himself surrounded, his military bearing finally cracking under the weight of inevitable capture. "Colonel James Morrison," Lestrade announced formally, "you are under arrest for the murder of Rajesh Gupta and conspiracy against the Crown." As the constables secured Morrison and his violet-stained accomplices, Holmes turned his attention to the broader implications of our victory. From Morrison's coat, he extracted a flattened envelope containing banking instructions directed to Zurich, signed not by the colonel himself, but by one Hartwell. "The field commander captured, but the puppet masters remain hidden," Holmes observed, examining the document with his magnifying glass. "Morrison, Hartwell and Associates represents more than legal services, Inspector. We have exposed a single tentacle of an organization whose reach extends throughout the empire." Theodore Ashford, now free and recovering his composure, provided the final pieces of our complex puzzle. "Mr. Holmes, my disappearance was indeed orchestrated, but not by my enemies. I realized that Morrison's syndicate intended to eliminate all witnesses to the Jean de Nagor affair, myself included. The only protection lay in forcing them into the open while preserving the evidence necessary for their prosecution." Holmes nodded with evident satisfaction. "Your cryptic letter served its purpose admirably. Where the Thames meets the sky referred not to this location, but to the Greenwich meridian as it passes through your own study. The truth sleeps beneath the stones of memory, guided me to the hearthstone where you had concealed the genuine ledger." "But the ransom demand brought you here," I observed, still puzzled by the evening's elaborate choreography. "Precisely, Watson. Mr. Ashford's captors believed they held both him and the location of the true ledger. By allowing them to dictate terms while providing a carefully prepared decoy, we drew them into a trap of their own making." Holmes held up the burst satchel with its telltale violet stains. "The real ledger remains safely at Baker Street, its contents documenting 30 years of systematic corruption that extends far beyond tonight's arrests." As we prepared to depart Greenwich Observatory, the scene of so much drama and revelation, Holmes paused to observe the clearing sky where stars had begun to appear through the dissipating fog. The atmospheric conditions that had concealed so much deception throughout our investigation were finally lifting, revealing truths that 3 decades of careful concealment could no longer obscure. "The fog has served its purpose, Watson," he observed with characteristic precision. "It provided cover for the guilty while ultimately exposing their crimes to proper scrutiny. Tonight marks not the end of our investigation, but rather its transformation from mystery to justice." Morrison, secured between 2 constables, made one final attempt at defiance. "Mr. Holmes, you have won this particular engagement, but the syndicate we created has tentacles reaching throughout the empire. My removal will merely prompt others to assume control." "Perhaps, Colonel," Holmes acknowledged, "but justice begins with individual accountability. Your crimes will be answered, regardless of the broader conspiracy you represent. The ledger you sought to suppress will ensure that the Chandernagore massacre and its aftermath receive the scrutiny they have long deserved." As we made our way back toward London through the clearing night, Theodore Ashford walked beside us as a free man, his elaborate gamble having preserved both his life and the evidence necessary to expose decades of imperial corruption. The case that had begun with an impossible disappearance in a locked room had evolved into something far more significant, revealing the dark underbelly of colonial administration and the lengths to which powerful men would go to preserve their secrets. The game, as Holmes would say, had reached its most satisfying conclusion, where patient deduction and careful preparation had triumphed over violence and conspiracy. Yet even in victory, we remained mindful that tonight's arrests represented merely the beginning of a longer campaign to root out the corruption that had flourished in Empire's shadow for far too long. The morning sun, streaming through our Baker Street windows, found London transformed. The oppressive fog that had shrouded our investigation finally lifted to reveal a city cleansed and clarified. Holmes sat at his desk with the genuine ledger open before him, its pages revealing the full scope of the conspiracy that had claimed Rajesh Gupta's life and threatened so many others. The violet powder that had marked our adversaries at Greenwich had proven as effective as any constable's truncheon, leaving Morrison's accomplices identifiable beyond any possibility of denial. Inspector Lestrade arrived with news that confirmed Holmes's most pessimistic assessments of the case's broader implications. "The interrogations have proven most illuminating, Mr. Holmes," he reported, settling into the chair opposite my friend. "Colonel Morrison has provided a complete confession, though I suspect more from pragmatic calculation than genuine remorse. The network we've exposed extends far beyond what any of us initially imagined." Theodore Ashford, now fully recovered from his ordeal and reunited with his grateful niece, provided the final pieces of our complex puzzle. His explanation revealed the true genius of his elaborate deception, though it had been born from desperate necessity rather than mere intellectual exercise. "Mr. Holmes, I realized 3 days ago that Morrison's syndicate intended to eliminate all witnesses to the Chandernagore affair," Ashford explained, his voice steady despite the gravity of his revelations. "The foreign correspondence I received was not a threat, but intelligence from a former associate warning me that my name had appeared on what he termed a final accounting. My only protection lay in forcing them into the open while preserving the evidence necessary for their prosecution." Holmes nodded with evident satisfaction, his fingers tracing entries in the ledger with characteristic precision. "Your cryptic letter served multiple purposes admirably, Mr. Ashford. To your enemies, it suggested supernatural intervention and inevitable fate designed to accelerate their timeline and force precipitous action. To those with eyes to see, it provided precise directions to both your location and the evidence they sought. The technical explanation of the locked room mystery proved elegantly simple once Holmes laid out the mechanics. The scaffolding had provided not merely cover, but the essential infrastructure for Ashford's escape. Elijah Crowe, the missing workman, had secured a tarred rope from the horizontal beam to the study window, creating a bridge that could be traversed under cover of fog and darkness. The window catches of a simple spring pattern could be manipulated from outside using a thin strip of whalebone, leaving them securely fastened when James broke down the door. "The breaking glass that awakened Miss Ashford was indeed a signal," Holmes continued, "but not from within the study. Crowe, positioned among the laurel bushes, shattered a cheap spirit bottle at the prearranged time to mark the completion of the operation. The crystal paperweight's faint scratches indicated its use to reflect a lantern signal toward the garden, confirming that the way was clear for your uncle's departure." The broader implications of our discoveries proved as troubling as Holmes had anticipated. The ledger represented not merely evidence of historical corruption, but a comprehensive record of ongoing operations that had evolved into something approaching a shadow government within the empire's administrative structure. Systematic payments to officials throughout the colonial hierarchy had created a network of complicity that extended from the India Office to Parliament itself. Most disturbing, Holmes observed, turning to sections marked with red ink, are these entries documenting the elimination of potential witnesses over 2 decades. Rajesh Gupta's murder was merely the latest in a series of deaths, each carefully disguised as accident or natural causes. Morrison's surgical precision with a blade was not developed for a single operation. Inspector Lestrade's subsequent investigations revealed the full extent of Morrison, Hartwell, and Associates' operations. The firm had maintained offices throughout the empire, serving as a legitimate front for money laundering and intelligence gathering. Most significantly, Mrs. Hartwell, revealed to be Rupert Hartwell's widowed sister rather than a simple housekeeper, had been placed within the Ashford household years earlier to monitor activities of interest to the syndicate. The violet powder that marked our adversaries at Greenwich has proven invaluable in tracing their broader network, Lestrade reported with evident satisfaction. The chemical analysis has identified participants we might never have connected to the conspiracy through conventional investigation. Your foresight in preparing that particular trap, Mr. Holmes, has yielded dividends far beyond our immediate success. Percival Dunn, when confronted with the evidence recovered from the hearthstone and his own violet-stained clothing, abandoned his previous denials in favor of cooperation. His account revealed both the personal desperation that had made him vulnerable to Morrison's coercion and the deeper loyalty that had ultimately led him to assist in Ashford's elaborate deception. "I carried the satchel from the docks with the intention of purchasing my freedom," Dunn admitted, his voice heavy with shame and relief. "But when Theodore explained the true scope of Morrison's intentions, I realized that compliance would merely delay rather than prevent our destruction. The plan we devised was desperate, but it offered the only possibility of survival for both of us." As our investigation drew to its close, Holmes provided his characteristic analytical summary of the case's resolution. "The fog that concealed so much deception ultimately served justice rather than criminality," he observed, settling back in his chair with evident satisfaction. Mr. Ashford's elaborate disappearance drew his enemies into the open while preserving the evidence necessary for their prosecution. The supernatural elements of his letter masked very practical intelligence, while the locked-room mystery concealed simple mechanical ingenuity. Miss Evangeline Ashford, whose courage throughout the ordeal had impressed us all, listened to Holmes's exposition with a mixture of horror and relief. "Uncle Theodore has lived under threat of death for 30 years, she whispered, maintaining those terrible records as his only protection against men who would stop at nothing to preserve their secrets. "Precisely, Miss Ashford," Holmes replied gently. "Your uncle understood that his survival depended upon making himself more valuable alive than dead. The ledger represented insurance against violence, creating a form of mutual assured destruction that protected him as long as the records remained secure and their contents unknown to his enemies. The prosecutions that followed would shake the foundations of London society, though Holmes characteristically declined public recognition for his role in exposing the conspiracy. Colonel Morrison faced charges including murder, while Rupert Hartwell's attempt to flee to the continent ended in arrest at Harwich with a valise of incriminating documents. The broader implications would unfold over months, leading to resignations, investigations, and long overdue reform of colonial administration. As evening settled over Baker Street and the last traces of the mysterious fog finally dissipated, Holmes reached for his violin with the satisfied expression that marked the successful conclusion of a challenging case. "Watson," he observed, drawing the bow across the strings in a single, contemplative note, "we have witnessed the resolution of crimes spanning an empire and touching the highest levels of government, yet the case began with nothing more than a missing person report and a cryptic letter written in a gentleman's own hand." The case of the letter, delivered by mist, had indeed reached its conclusion, though its broader consequences would continue to reverberate throughout the corridors of power for years to come. As Holmes settled into his familiar evening routine, and I prepared to record the final details of our investigation, I reflected upon the curious chain of events that had transformed a foggy November morning into one of our most significant triumphs over organized criminality and imperial corruption. The fog had lifted, at last, revealing truths that 30 years of careful concealment could no longer obscure, and justice had been served through the methodical application of observation, deduction, and the unwavering pursuit of truth that defined my remarkable friend's approach to the criminal mysteries of our age.